Hey there, I'm Paul Annacone, and so happy to be on the Double Bagel. So sit down, relax, and have a listen.
Paul, welcome on the show once again. It's been nearly a year since we last spoke. So tell us where you are and how busy are you with tennis these days?
Thanks for having me back. It's been a while. Well, it's been a crazy year for everybody, right? We've all had to pivot a little bit and try to adjust to the new times. But I'm currently in LA, been able to do a bunch of work at Tennis Channel, which has been terrific. Got to spend some time in the studio, seeing some great tennis down in Miami, and getting to spend a lot of time with Taylor Fritz. We had a nice off season before Australia, and then got some time before his last trip. And David Nankin and I are spending a lot of time with him on the court when he's not on the road, and that's about it. Just trying to stay active and hoping, fingers crossed, that things are getting a little bit more normal in society, and we can get everybody a little bit shifting back towards more normalcy and less of the unknown. So we'll see how that goes.
Mm. Many of the younger generation of tennis fans only know you as a commentator and a tennis coach to players like Federer, Sampras, Sloane Stevens, and currently to Taylor Fritz, as you mentioned. Many don't know that you're actually a top player yourself, winning the Australian Open doubles title in 1985. You reached a career high of number 3 in the world in doubles and 12 in singles. How do you look back on your playing career?
Um, I look back at it very fondly. I had a really great, enjoyable journey through it. I think a lot of times you don't really realize what you did or what you had until after it's gone. When you're wrapped up in it in the moment, I think it's more, for me, it was more goal oriented and more driven towards trying to achieve things. And I think as I look back and see what I was, fortunate enough to be able to do in terms of playing tennis for a living was pretty spectacular, regardless of whether I was 11 in the world or 411 in the world. I mean, I think that created a wealth of experiences for me that kind of has really been the framework for my life of kind of how I look at things and how I approach um, kind of adversity and pros and cons that come into play. So the tennis itself was tremendous, and it was enjoyable to play on center court at Wimbledon and the US Open and those things. But I try to look also at what it has given me in terms of life experiences to kind of move ahead. And probably that's been the foundation of my coaching philosophies and how I've gone about living the next chapter. So it's been pretty enjoyable and pretty interesting for me.
Interesting. Would you say you maximize your talent and ability?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I don't
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
I mean, I come from a small town in New York. To be able to say that I got to be ranked 12 in the world, I think is something I'm really proud of. I wish, like everyone else in their journeys, that maybe more results could have come, but I'm not a big believer in regret. I think it's always easy to look back and say could have, should have, whatever. I think the only thing you can do is go through all of these processes and make informed decisions with all the information you have at the moment. And I think that I did that, and the people that were guiding and were around me were really good at making the best decisions with all the information we had. So I think in that regard, I don't really have many regrets. The one thing that I think I wish I could have done differently is I wish I could have been a little bit more mentally clear about what I needed to continue to be successful and improve. And what I mean by that is, and I think a lot of young players do this now, is they try so hard to get better and to improve that they go away from what their strengths are, and they forget the dynamic of who they are as a player and a person. And so you're always searching, always searching, always searching, and sometimes you look too hard. And I don't think that is something that I knew in the time in my mid 20s. I didn't know that because I was always trying to improve. I was always trying to get better. So I think I found I found myself now looking back in retrospect, I was looking for things that probably didn't exist. So again, I look at that as a great experience for me and a really positive thing. So now as I coach and try to help people, I can take that to heart and kind of keep the foundation of what makes players who they are and what their games should be pretty clearly for me. And I tend to not look for magic pills because I think that quite frankly they don't exist.
You said you were trying too hard in a way, or
Yeah, I mean, you're looking for stuff, you're if you're ambitious and you're trying to improve, sometimes you take that too far and you get away from things that define your strengths and define you and your makeup as a person. And I think that that's a little bit of a trap. It's a trap for all young people in anything you do, but particularly in sports when your window of opportunity is much more narrow. And also, I think it's even a bigger trap when it's an individual sport, when you really are the one that's guiding your career.
mm,
And it's all about you. You don't have a team, you're not playing for an NFL team or an NBA team to really help form you. You're doing that yourself with your coach and the people around you. And I think that that makes it more of a challenge for a young person to really be the architect of their pathway. And I think that's why it's so important um, informationally for young players to figure this out. Look, I just started doing some work for Southern Cal Tennis Association and helping them a little bit with their player development. And I had a great call last night with a bunch of the really established coaches in the area. And it was so interesting for me to hear them and to hear what's been successful, what the challenges are with young players. And I think that you can take these things to really help formulate a plan that's going to maximize their talent, number one, and also make them happy and happier and healthier. It goes about it in a way where it's more pragmatic and less result focused in the moment. And I think all these things you can see in retrospect, but when you're in that picture, it's really difficult. That's why look, I'm a parent. That's why being a parent is so hard because you're
yeah,
emotionally attached and you're trying to guide your kid. So when you're a
mm,
20-year-old doing that for yourself in tennis, it's complicated. So look, all these experiences have been great for me, but like you just mentioned, I think the one thing that I would tweak a little bit is not search so hard
okay,
and to be a little bit more clear about what made me a terrific tennis player and what my assets were and how to maximize them and
mm,
not focus so much on what I couldn't do. Because
okay,
when you focus on what you can't do and what you're weaker at in life, if the emphasis is too much there,
yeah,
it gets depressing because it's not your strength, right?
yeah,
So you have to figure out how to shore up those weaknesses without diminishing or losing the magnification of what you're really good at. And
right,
and I think that that's a balance that's really difficult for any athletic coach, and I think it's a really difficult balance for a parent,
yeah,
for a kid that's developing in anything, whether it's the arts or education or sports, doesn't really matter. So
mm,
it's trying to figure out that balance. So all those things I kind of take to heart and file away in my little book of coaching and life coaching and try to use them to be a better parent and a better coach. And
yeah.
hopefully it's valuable now.
Mm. I mean, was coaching always on the cards after retirement, or was it just everything happened to be at the right place and the right time?
No, I think it kind of fell into place for me. I always was inquisitive and always was interested in learning and seeing what helped people excel. So that was interesting to me. And the tennis part of it I found really interesting because I grew up playing sports, but tennis being an individual sport, I thought was even more intriguing because the goal of a tennis coach for me was and is to give the student and the player all the tools to problem solve themselves under pressure. They've got to figure it out. There's no timeouts. You're on center court at Wimbledon with 12,000 people watching in the semifinals. You can't call timeout and go into the locker room and talk to your
Mm,
15 other teammates and
yeah,
draw up plays. And you've got to problem solve. So for me as a coach, I always found that kind of the ultimate challenge. An individual athlete where you're figuring it out yourself on the tennis court,
yeah,
in real time. And so that intrigued me. And after living it as a player and struggling and succeeding in areas both, I found it something really curious and interesting for me to participate in, because I wanted to see if I could help someone build their own skill sets to do those things for themselves on the court in the moment. And so when you see that come to fruition, it's really, really enjoyable when I see someone take something to heart and find the ability to find solutions under pressure. That to me is a good thing. Whether it's a tennis solution or a life solution, it's nice to see.
Would you say coaching is more about talking or listening?
I think it's both. I think too many
Okay.
people think it's more about talking,
Yeah.
but I probably I definitely have learned more from the people that I've been around, probably than I've taught them. And I think so much of it is hearing information from Sloane Stevens and Tim Henman and Roger Federer and Pete Sampras, and Taylor, 23-year-old Taylor. I learn stuff from Taylor all the time because he's 23. We live in a different world. If I only taught and talked and dictated, I don't think that one-way communication line is the way to go about it. I think you have to be able to absorb information and be empathetic and understand versus do. It's there's a two-way communication that needs to take place.
I mean, you've mentioned that you've coached players like Pete Sampras, Tim Henman, Roger Federer, Sloane Stevens, and now Taylor Fritz. What are the differences between coaching someone who has accomplished so much already, so like Pete and Roger, compared to players like Taylor and Sloane who are still trying to build their careers?
Right. I mean, look, it's really interesting, right? I think coaching philosophies vary, right? And with someone, with people like Roger and Pete that have done so much, you really have to be aware of the environment you're in, because it is so atypical, because of the status of who they are as athletes. So that environment's way different than me, starting with Taylor when he was 20 years old. Taylor is someone that's young. So, luckily he had a great foundation, and he has and had someone like David Nankin, who's built in so many wonderful things. But the idea for a young player is to build a foundation around them so that they see what can be, not what is. And I think it's very difficult for people to find that balance between what can be and still have the passion for what is, because we all want instant gratification. We all want instant results. And, that's one of Taylor's challenges. Taylor's one of the most gifted young players out there, but he's also one of the most stubborn. And that stubbornness is both an asset and a liability. And it's an asset because he's one of the most relentless competitors I've ever seen. And that's going to bring him a lot of accolades, but it's also going to bring him a lot of frustration if he doesn't adapt a little bit and learn to turn the stubbornness down and be a little bit more open. And he's getting better at it, but it's a work in progress. And so with Taylor, we're trying to lay out a blueprint of what the next 3 to 10 years can look like. And sure, it's really important this week, his 250 level event in Italy. That's great, but what happens this week can't be the driving force of the equation and the recipe you're putting together. And what happens next week in Monte Carlo can't be that. So that's very difficult to articulate to a young person. And I think it's more difficult for the young person to absorb and buy into. Whereas someone like Pete and Roger, for me, they were the kings of understanding macro. They were the best I've ever seen at understanding big picture. Everything mattered and nothing mattered. And that's a very bizarre thing to say, but it's really true, because they realized what every moment meant, but they also realized how little that moment meant and how much it meant. And none of it was going to detract from what their big picture plan was. And I find the greatest of the greats are really able to do that in a pragmatic way that so many of us could learn from. And that's where I tell you, like you asked before, that's where I learned a ton from Roger and Pete about understanding that macro. So if I were able to kind of weave that into the developmental plans of, the coaches in Southern Cal Tennis Association, all the private industry coaches with their 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, that to me would be the one thread to really hold on to. Picture what you want this player to be 10 years from now, not tomorrow, not next week. And that's a hard thing to do because none of us want to lose and we all want instantaneous gratification. But look, it's a journey, and I'm like, learn all the time, and it's a fun one.
I mean, what are the personality differences between, let's say, Roger, Pete, and Taylor?
Well, that's the thing that to me, selfishly, that's really enjoyable about coaching individual sports is you have to adjust to different personalities. And Roger is a citizen of the world, loves to travel around, loves having his family and friends and seeing museums and architecture and shows. And Pete wasn't like that. Pete was more introverted. He needed to live more in a bubble to be successful. He needed less people around, wanted to be a little bit more sheltered, particularly when he is at events. That microcosm of his existence was what he needed. It's very different. It would have drove Roger crazy.
Yeah.
But Pete looks at Roger and wonders, how can a guy even play when his life is so busy?
Yeah.
So as a coach, you have to figure out those subtleties and how to manage it. Taylor is Taylor. He's young and he's still developing his personality and his life traits, and he's still relatively new on tour. So he's trying to figure those things out. And for me and David Nankin and his team, it's about trying to help mold them for Taylor so he makes good decisions.
I mean, you've worked with 3 top 10 players, Sampras, Henman, and Federer. And from my understanding, Sloane wasn't in the top 10 yet when you were working with her?
I don't even remember.
Oh,
I don't remember.
anyway.
She was thereabouts.
Yeah,
she was
thereabouts.
but she was
I guess
thereabouts.
out of the 3, so Pete, Tim, and Roger, personally, who do you think was the biggest challenge for you to coach, and why?
I don't think anyone was greater or worse. I think that the key, and I don't mean to dodge the question, but I think the key with individual sports, like I said, it's everyone's different.
Yeah.
You need different things. Like with Pete, I needed to be really succinct in giving him information. He didn't want to sit around and talk about tennis for 2 hours. I had to figure it out. With Roger, I needed to be creative. He's very artistic, likes to hear new things, likes to debate new things. With Tim, he needs and really enjoys challenges and enjoyed to make it fun and competitive in games. So you have to know all these nuances. And with Sloane, she was a lot younger. So she's trying to figure out her standard operating procedure. So as a coach, you're trying to evaluate this stuff in your mind so you know how to manage and push the right buttons at the right moment. I never look at it as better or worse or easier or hard. I look at differences.
Yeah.
And all those differences as a coach to me are what makes it challenging, because then I've got to figure something out.
Yeah.
It's not, here's the blueprint, here's what we do every day, here's how it's going to work. You take certain commonalities, but then you have to plug in all those blueprints that we just talked about and figure out how to deliver it to get the messages to be bought in by the player.
You talked about Taylor's stubbornness. Is that something that you find difficult in a way?
Taylor's stubbornness?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's challenging for me, but I wouldn't want him to be the opposite. I wouldn't want him to just roll over and do everything I say. I sure it's a challenge, but I look at it as a strength for him too. So I take the challenge with the asset it creates as well. So there are times where I wish he would say, no, I could say, no, you're 23. I'm not. I've done this for 30 years.
Yeah.
Just do what I say.
Yeah.
Sure, there are times I wish I could do that. But part of his strength is the ability to have a belief system that he can rely on. And that's why that stubbornness is actually a strength. And that's one of the reasons why he wins a lot of close matches. And that's another reason why I am so encouraged by what his potential is, because it's also that asset.
I mean, was Pete and Roger stubborn?
Yes, in a very different way.
Okay.
Um, Ironically, it was easier for me to convince Roger and Pete to do things at
Okay.
times than Taylor.
Yeah.
Um, but they were older and more mature when I was with them, right? Taylor's
Right.
still a kid, but if Pete disagreed with me, he would disagree, but I didn't need to have a law degree to convince him of what if I gave him the facts, he would just shift.
Yeah.
Roger was the same. If you give them Taylor, sometimes I feel like I've got to go to law school to figure out how I can convince him that I'm
Yeah.
right. But again, that can be a strength.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of him just tweaking that valve a little bit to be a little bit more
Mm.
okay. Paul and David, they've been doing this for 40 years. They might know a little bit more about this situation than me,
Yeah.
even though I feel this certain way.
Yeah.
That's very hard. It's really hard to get, as a person as well, it's very hard to get a person to feel differently about something. And if you have
Mm.
someone with strong convictions, those feelings are more difficult to alter. So you better have a lot of facts to back them up. And hopefully that person will buy into those facts and be able to kind of shift a little bit. And Taylor has shifted some. Is it as far as I would like? Absolutely not. But it's better than it was, and hopefully that learning curve continues to grow, and his
Mm.
flexibility continues to grow. And if it doesn't, that's his choice. He's not 15 anymore. He's 23.
Yeah. I mean, how nervous were you at the start when you were coaching Pete, considering he was your first major coaching job?
um I was really nervous, but luckily at the time the late great Tim Gullickson was mentoring me, so I had a kind of a very good friend and a genius coach in my corner
Yeah.
mentoring me through this with telephone calls. So I had someone who knew Pete incredibly well that helped mold how I needed to act and react.
Yeah.
And also, Pete was young. Pete was Taylor's age when I started with him. He was
Okay.
23.
Yeah.
Um, but he had also, I believe, won 4 majors already, 3 or 4. And he had a very clear vision of who he was and how he needed to do things. So actually, Pete helped me a lot. Pete helped
Okay.
me manage his environment and understand his environment better of how it needed to work for him to be successful. So I had really good people helping me. And because I had played and I was relatively young, it was very fresh in my mind about what the life was and what needed to happen. The thing that wasn't fresh in my mind was being around a superstar and having that work because I wasn't that. I was
Mm.
a pretty good player, but I wasn't number one in the world winning major titles. So I had to learn that, and like I said, I had good people helping.
Mm. What would you say was the lowest moment when you were coaching Pete?
The lowest moment,
Yeah.
um, I think at the end of his career, just to see the pain and frustration he was going through chasing another major title and just watching how he had to deal with the media. And you know the media back then wasn't like it is today, luckily, because wasn't social media. But the thing that was challenging was it's the same then as it is now, is that you're only as good as really what your brand is. So Pete and all these great players tend to only really make news when they lose. And so when a great player loses consistently, there's think of every day they go into a press conference, what's wrong, there's always a negative connotation about what's happening.
Yeah.
And so for 25 months, Pete didn't win a tournament. And so for 25 months, he dealt with the negativity and the question marks and the gray area. And can you do it again? And that's painful. That's hard. No matter
Yeah.
how confident you are, that's hard. So to watch Pete go through that was pretty challenging for me. To watch him lose on an outside court at Wimbledon in 2002 was, I wasn't coaching him then. I was running player development for the USTA, but I saw that match, and that was hard for me just to see the pain that he was in trying to figure it out.
Mm.
So to see him go through that was really difficult, but
Mm.
it got very quickly erased when he won the US Open 8 weeks after that. So
Mm.
that to me was it was just a testimony to how amazing of an individual Pete Sampras was. People forget how great he was. And for him to come back after 25 months of not winning any event
Yeah.
and to go to the US Open and everyone going, you know, he can't do it, he can't do it, he can't do it. And to watch him just march along and do it for the 14th time, for me, was just a reaffirmation of a level of greatness that separates him from 99.9% of the great champions we've seen.
So I guess his lowest moment was also around his highest moment, you'd say.
I think so.
Yeah.
You know, he might say winning Wimbledon in 2000 when he broke the record of all-time majors for a man at that time, when he broke Emerson's record, and that was number 13.
Yeah.
But while that was great, I actually think that to me, this sounds really arrogant, but for him at that moment in time, it wasn't really an if he was going to break the record. It was just when. To me, it was which one of the next majors is he was going to win. So I didn't think it wasn't going to happen. I just wondered when. Whereas after he hadn't won a tournament for 25 months, when there's a lot more doubt in the atmosphere, to see someone turn that around, to me, that may be even more significant.
I mean, I want to move on to talk about arguably the biggest player you've coached, Roger Federer. You've got to know Roger better than most people in the world. What is his greatest strength as a player and as a person?
I think they go hand in hand. I think his greatest strength as a player and a person is his perspective. I mean, I think he really understands life. And I think that because he understands life and the ability to prioritize things and the pragmatism with which he approaches stuff has allowed him to do what he loves for this long. And those elements, along with the fact that he just loves tennis, that's why at 39 he's still out there and right now trying to get healthy to play again later this year, because he loves what he's doing. He doesn't have the emotional drain at 39 that Pete had at 29 or 30. And that doesn't make one person better or worse. It's just their different personalities. Pete was kind of fatigued from that life, whereas Roger thrives on this life. He thrives on being all over the world with his family and seeing how different people live and how different societies act and interact, and playing on different tennis courts. That stuff doesn't outweigh the burden of being an icon. And Roger's an icon. You know, he goes everywhere, and it's tough to go anywhere because he doesn't get much peace and quiet, and it doesn't drain him. So he's an amazing human being, but he genuinely loves life, understands the perspective and priorities in his life, and is one of the most gifted athletes I've ever seen. So when you put all those things together, it gives you a recipe for longevity, and that's what we've seen.
How do players like Roger and Pete handle constructive criticism?
Well, I mean, I haven't, you know, I never had an issue, I don't think, with either one of them, because it goes back to what I talked about, is if you know the personality and how to deliver it, good and bad, then it's fine. You know, I could say to Roger, you know, I know you're thinking this, but here's why I think that doesn't work. And then we have a discussion about it. If I went, Roger, that's stupid, what are you doing? That's a problem. You know, you just have to figure out how to go into the disagreement in a way where it isn't personal. It's just about facts, about what you're seeing. And Pete was the same way. If I just said to him, look, you're going to be more successful if you learn to put pressure on people's second serve by using your athleticism coming forward. And he says, why? I actually think that gives away too much because it's too risky. Then we just have a normal conversation and we debate things in a very pragmatic way. And we tend to get to a middle ground that makes sense, that we both understand. So I found it very easy to talk to them about things that we weren't on the same page about. And to me, that was one of the joys and one of the pleasant surprises about both of them, you know, because I often thought, how can you be this great and also know that you might not know everything all the time? That's a challenge, because these guys are always getting their egos blown up everywhere they go, all over the world. And yet I've got to, in the right way, have to say, you know, Roger, that's kind of not right. Or Pete, you know, this probably isn't the best strategy. You know, that you have to have the right people that you're working with to do that. And I've been so lucky because those guys were amazing. They were able to hear things that maybe they didn't want to hear, but also were open to tweaking things to becoming better.
I mean, you and Roger had a 3-year plan: win another Grand Slam title and get back to world number one. Both of them were accomplished. How surprising was it to you that your coaching relationship would have ended so soon, the year after he won Wimbledon?
It didn't surprise me at all, really. I think we had a really nice talk in the fall of 2013, kind of a year later in Dubai, just about. I thought it was great because we were both kind of like, okay, this is what we set out to do. This is what we did. We did that. Now what? And we both kind of had a really nice lunch and just talked about the fact that probably it was the time to go professionally our own separate ways. So for me, it was I actually didn't. I felt like it was exactly what we had talked about because we
Mhm.
talked about the plan and we got to know each other so well that initially in our relationship we just talked about how we've both been through a lot in terms of tennis and coaching and relationships that we made a pact that it was when it was time to stop, it was time to stop. Didn't
Yeah.
mean either one of us was a bad person, didn't mean we weren't going to be friends all. So it was very, to me, it was very easy. It was
Yeah.
easy to have the conversation. And it was really correct because if you looked at what happened since then with Roger, he's had a bunch of regenerations of his career since then, which have been, for me, it's been amazing to watch. And every time I see it happen, I'm more in awe of what he's able to do. So I think the evolution and kind of, you know, the pathway of the journey
Yeah.
was laid out exactly how we wanted it to be laid out. And sure, I wish he had won more major titles, but he won the one that the goal was to win another one to get back to number one, and he was able to do that. So I was really pleased to be able, to take part in his journey and to participate with his team in doing that. So I was pretty fortunate.
Do you think you could have added more to his game if you stayed longer?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, let me put it this way. I think I could have, but I don't think if I stayed with him. I think like with Pete, I think it would have had to be the same thing.
Mhm.
Pete and I stopped working together. Uh, we stopped working together for a long period of time, right? We were away from each other probably for a year or something. And then I came back. And then once I came back, there was a little bit of a rejuvenation. And I think we both were excited about it. And I think that helped, m- you know, um, in terms of comfort for Pete, but also it was very rejuvenating to me because it was
Yeah.
reinvented. Okay, we had to break apart, and I think that was why I was able to coach Pete again. And I'm sure that's not why he won the US Open as much as I would like to say it was, but I'm sure it did. I'm confident that it did help and it was an ingredient for him to get remotivated. So for Roger, it would have had to be the same thing. I don't think I could have just stayed. For instance, if I went away for 2 years and then I came back and helped a little bit, could I have helped again? Sure, I could have. But I think at that time, it was definitely the right time for him to make a change and to have a new voice. He had the steadying voice and demeanor of Severin Luthi, who's
Yeah.
unbelievable, never gets enough credit, but is an amazing coach in person. And then he added Stefan Edberg after that. So I think that was really the right dynamic for him. So I think everything played out the way it should have.
I actually wanted to ask about Roger's other coach, Severin Luthi, who you've worked with, obviously. What is he like as a person? What does he bring to Roger and Team Roger?
Well, first of all, probably no one knows Roger better than Severin except Mirka, his
Okay.
wife,
Yeah.
because he's been with him for so long. And I think that talk about being able to be critical. Severin was very critical with Roger, to Roger, in a really good way because they're really good friends. They knew each other, and he could listen to Severin, and so they had a great open and have a great open dynamic relationship. And he's been with them and part of their family for so long that I think the social comfort allowed a lot more latitude in what he was doing professionally. And I think that professionally he's a great coach. And because he got along and knows Roger so well and knows Mirka and their family so well, he's able to manage and work within the environment
Mm,
extremely productively, which I think is a huge value to Roger.
mm. I mean, someone else I wanted to ask about was Sloane Stevens. It was a short 8 months coaching relationship. Why do you think it didn't work out with Sloane as you would have hoped?
Well, it's just like, it's just like I just said about Roger. You kind of have to know, um, you kind of have to know like what the plan is and what the pathway is going to be, right?
Mm,
And for someone like Sloane, it was different because she was younger and she was still developing. I think one of the hardest things for Sloane is that at that time in her life, the year before I was working with her, she got to the semis of Australia and beat Serena Williams, and all of these expectations were thrown on her. And she kind of wasn't ready for that yet. She kind of wasn't ready to learn how to manage it. And I was trying to figure out how to help her learn how to manage that
mm,
and still keep the macro picture in place, which is just becoming a better tennis player and becoming more comfortable in your environment. So when you combine those two things, we spent, 8 months or 9 months or whatever together, really working on a bunch of different levels, personally, professionally, managing this new environment, the new set of expectations, who you are in the tennis world, how to travel, how to live, and then also understanding you're still pretty young in terms of your tennis development. So we got to work on the tennis skills too. And I just don't think we were ever able to really mesh those things.
okay.
And, when we talked about stopping, again, it was the same conversation. It was a very similar conversation in Roger for a different reason. It was, we both understood that we had tried a lot of different dynamics to get me to kind of help learn how to deliver the messages the right way and press the buttons to activate and keep things engaged for long periods of time. And it never worked. It never sustained. It
Right.
would be one step forward and then kind of we'd back up. And, and that's my job as a coach. How do I get it to sustain? So really the conversation it wasn't a blame game at all. It was just like, I'm not sure what to do anymore. Like I've tried all my strategies and I don't know what to do. And she said, "You're right. I don't really know what to do either." And I said, I just said, I think you should try to find someone that has a little bit of a different philosophy than me and has different philosophies than what I've tried that you feel like you can kind of get anchored in. And we just talked about it like that. And it was very simple. And she said, "Yeah, I think you're right." And neither one of us knew who that was or how to do it,
Yeah.
but that our professional path kind of had just come to that stop sign because we were both kind of, okay, what should we try to do now? And I didn't know anymore because I tried everything that I'd known up to that point. And to me, that was disappointing because I felt a little bit of a sense of failure for me, not in her, for me, because that's my job. My job as a coach is how do I get her to do it? And I wasn't able to. So I felt like it was a shortcoming of me.
Yeah.
And so, but I thought it was healthier for her to figure out then who should it be and how can I do that? And so like to this day, she's still, a very dear friend. I still
Yeah.
text her all the time and talk to her mom. I mean, we're so good friends. So that to me, that I take more pride in that stuff generally than
Yeah.
my professional
Mm,
relationships because it talks about the dynamic of the people behind them.
mm,
So if we're still pretty comfortable friends, that means
mm.
there's more to it than just
Yeah.
hit your forehand and backhand. I like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And you talked about that when she was young when you were coaching her. Would you say it was more of a case of right time, a right team, but wrong timing?
Could have been, yeah. That's a good way to
Okay.
look at it. Could have
Yeah.
been, yeah. I think it was we were in maybe a different place in terms of the development stuff that I wanted to try to do than where she was ready to go.
Yeah.
And that's why I think sometimes with all these young players, when you see instantaneous success, be careful because when you crash onto a scene of greatness and you're at a very young age and you're not formed yet, it's not easy. And very rarely, that's why you see people like Serena and Venus and Rafa and even Pete at 19 and Roger was a little bit older. When you see them come on to the tour and find a way to stay there at that level of eliteness, it's pretty remarkable. But for
Mm,
most people, it's really challenging.
mm. I mean, last part of the interview, Paul. So I'm going to name 5 players you've played against. Can you tell me in a few sentences how you would play them, sort of strategy, I guess? So the first one, let's start with Ivan Lendl.
How Von Lendl.
Yeah.
Have to find ways to keep the ball away from his forehand,
Yeah.
and you have to find ways to make him beat you with passing shots on his backhand.
Mats Wilander.
Um, you have to be unbelievably strong mentally because he will not go away, will not miss. You have to find ways to attack his serve and hope that you have enough weapons to make him uncomfortable.
Michael Chang.
Similar to Matt's in that,
Okay.
so resilient, so speedy. You have to find a way to definitely impact his serve, and you have to do a really good job taking care of your own serve, because he's relentless.
John McEnroe.
He's an interesting one because he was so offensive, and athletic. You have to be able to hold your service games because it was so difficult in his prime to break his serve. You have to be able to hold your service games and hope you can get some looks at his second serve to put some pressure on him.
And last one, Stefan Edberg.
You have to, well, for me, I came to the net, so I had to try to beat him to the net because I wasn't going to pass him. He's too great of an athlete. But you have to beat him on his forehand side and realize that his forehand is not as bad as people used to think it was. He didn't ever miss it. Was a great athlete and a great mental approach to the game, and arguably the greatest volleyer that played. So take care of your serve, make him beat you on his forehand, and come to the net before he does.
And Paul, thanks a lot once again for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No, thanks so much. I really appreciate the patience, Eric. You take care of yourself.